Thank you, Peter, and very pleased to be here. What I'd like to do is talk about three things. The first is just to recap on how we see the challenge and the problem in government, which I think is probably no different to any other set of organisations. Then to talk a bit about what we're doing, and three things in particular. And then to throw out three areas where I'm thinking that as we look at what's happening in government and what we're finding, the debate may move into over the next decade, and to really sort of lay that out and see, begin to know whether you agree, and also to suggest these are areas where we collectively might want to focus our attention. So let me start with the problem statement. I mean, Fiona's framed it very well. It's fundamentally about representation. For us, for customer, you can read citizen. It is completely unacceptable that the civil service, public service generally, is not representative of the citizens it serves at every level. And the at every level is the key point, as it is in many other organisations, I think. So our challenge is, how do we make sure that, particularly at the senior level, we have a full representation? Now, there are other challenges. There are challenges around what it feels like to be a member of any particular community, and of course most people are members of many communities, and that's why the issue of intersectionality is so important. But how does it feel to be a member of a particular community, to have particular characteristics in an organisation, and how are you being treated? So I think please take it as read, because I'm not going to sort of really refer to it, that there are big challenges still, I believe, around chauvinism against women in the workplace, actually, across society. And we know, if we look at our, I think in our engagement surveys, we will see that there are populations like our LGBT colleagues who are probably experiencing a less pleasant workplace than many others. So all those issues are important. We have, when we constructed our civil service diversity strategy, which we developed and launched last year, we were particularly keen to look at areas where we'd not done well enough. And the areas that we particularly focused on were senior representation for people from ethnic minorities and people with disabilities. And what we looked at the progress that had been made, still not enough in terms, for example, of getting women into senior roles, and we compared that with what I think is a very disappointing performance in getting people from ethnic minority groups into those roles and people with disabilities into those senior roles. And as we know, that has very profound implications for the whole agenda, because we know that people are attracted to organisations where they can see senior role models who they will want to follow into those organisations. And so if you have a predominantly white male top table, that is going to be a problem for that, to meet that objective. So we looked at it and took what I think is quite a bold and exciting move, which is we set targets. Now, I think the key thing here is not so much that we set targets, but how we set targets. So we said, and the targets are here, hopefully you can see them on the screens, very happy to share these with you, they're in the public domain. We knew that this was not going to be successful if we imposed those targets from above. So we went through quite a lengthy exercise working with individual departments who, across the very wide sector that is the UK civil service, that embraces prison officers, people in job centres, Whitehall policy civil servants, people in consular missions overseas, looking at that whole population and saying, what is the appropriate target or aspiration for ethnic representation and representation of people with disabilities at that most senior level in each department. And the process that we went through actually produced some really interesting conversations. And when the final numbers came in, or rather the penultimate numbers came in, we had a very constructive challenge saying to some departments, actually, you can edge it up here, you're not being ambitious enough. Equally, I would say, also, be realistic. This is too, this is going to take longer than you think, and got those down. So these are the aggregate targets. And what they are, which is quite important, is they are targets for flow, not for stock. And so this is saying that by the time we get to the end of this period, 2022, 2025, on the right there, our flow of people into the senior civil service, which is about 4,000 people out of around 450,000 individuals, we should be at that level of 13.2%. Is that too low? Possibly. Is it realistic? Possibly it's a bit ambitious. It's a careful balance. We've said that we will review them over time as we see things coming out. Of course, as many people here will know, if you look at the numbers of graduates from universities over the next decade, that number is below the number of people coming out of universities from ethnic minorities. So maybe that's not ambitious enough. But in any event, it's a number around which we can consolidate. And the same with disability. Now, once you set that target, in a sense, or that ambition, that aspiration, then the question then becomes, how do you actually get there, and what processes do you need to do to achieve that? We know that there are big issues around attraction. We know that there are some people, particularly from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who did not feel they would get into the civil service if they applied. We wanted to bust that myth. That also comes back to the question of role models and related issues. And we also wanted to make sure, particularly in the area of disability, that people felt that we could have, that we were going to be an accommodating workplace in which we could make the right adjustments for a very wide range of circumstances that people would have. So targets was is an important part of that, and the mechanisms that forced us to look at. One of the mechanisms which we looked at very closely was the fast stream. Now, the fast stream is Britain's largest graduate employment scheme. We took about 1,500 people this year through that, and it's a bit of a jewel in the crown for us, actually. It's a very important way of making sure that we have a good, safe pipeline over the sort of the 10-year time it takes to get into the senior civil service for having great leaders in the senior civil service. Now, the fast stream had been criticised rightly for not being socially diverse, for not being diverse in terms of socioeconomic background, and we brought in an independent organisation, Bridge, to look at that and to advise on ways in which we could make it more diverse. Now, of course, the great thing about any initiative in this area around mechanisms around diversity and inclusion is that if you take a process and optimise it, and we have the other advantage in government that we are constitutionally required to run fair and open competitions and be meritocratic, but in any event, for any system, any recruitment system, if you make it neutral and better for people with of all backgrounds, you're making it better for everybody, and you're going to get better talent into the organisation. So it's a fantastic thing to be doing. What Bridge focused on was our testing process, our branding, and they also focused on the time to offer, which was multiple weeks, when in fact most employers, for many people in this room, are probably running processes of more like sort of 15, 20 weeks from the start of a selection process to making an offer. So what we did was we completely re-engineered our fast stream recruitment process. We put an assessment centre in a different part of the country, in Newcastle, and then we got it running. And we were also very transparent about the ethnic representation of people who are applying and people who are successfully getting in. And through that process, we discovered an area of complacency for us, I would say, which is that we thought things were getting better. They were for the ethnic minority populations as a group as a whole, so the BAME group as a whole. But actually, when you broke it down through our segmented data, people of Black Caribbean heritage were not doing anywhere near as well as we would want or expect demographically. So what that has forced us to do is to look very intently at the process, looking at where in the process the problem was occurring. And interestingly, the new techniques... Oops, sorry. Hope that's still working. Yeah. The new techniques, like video interviewing and E-tray exercises, were much better or much more balanced in terms of people who were coming through. The problem mostly was where a human was involved, which is probably not a surprise. So that means that we knew where we had to direct our bias training, where we needed to look at the techniques that interviewers were using, and also where we could use video interviewing in more effective ways. And we've also done, I think, quite a good innovation this year. We've been running it for a couple of months, which is, with this year's round, we are actually stopping the process at various points to see how we're doing. And then we are adjusting the pass marks, because the way we start is we set a very high pass mark, we get people on that basis, then we know we've got a number of places, so we lower the pass mark. And the extent to which we lower the pass mark, and we're talking about not lowering it a lot, these are very, it's a very demanding scheme, but the amount at which you lower it will have an impact on your diversity. So we're doing that as well, and that's already having an effect. And we're using the Civil Service Commissioners to help us with that, and other experts, all guided by a task force which is overseeing these targets with permanent secretaries and external representation. So this is a really a very important part of what we're doing. If anyone would like to talk a bit more about it to anyone, very happy to do that. Bernadette, at the end, if you want to stick your hand up, Bernadette, is very heavily involved in this in the fast stream. The second mechanism that I'd just like to talk about is networks. And over the past sort of decade, I've got more and more excited about the opportunity that staff networks present for us across our organisations. And I think their role is to be a form of channeled and organised impatience. And they work very well, and they are definitely worth investing in and supporting. The interesting challenge with them is that we're moving in this whole area, I think, from what I would feel is an entrepreneurial era, where single individuals have done a huge amount of heavy lifting, to an industrial era where we need to keep their passion, but really make sure that things are embedded in the business as usual practices. And that's something which we're doing at the moment. And also they have a very important role to play in terms of the intersectional debates that we're having as well. And just to flag a second colleague, Rob Neal, who heads one of our networks, Rob. Rob will be very happy to talk to you about what he's doing in that area. And the third thing to mention is the way in which we're looking at inclusion. We talked there, you'll see we've talked about representation. The other leg of our strategy is inclusion, which we do think is a different topic, and one where we've set ourselves a very ambitious goal of being the most inclusive employer by 2020 in the UK. Will we meet that goal? I don't know. We set it as a very ambitious target. We set it knowing, rather the way we had with our ambition on socioeconomic background, without actually knowing how we would measure it. So we're now engaged in a process over the next 18 months, and Rachel, who's there as well, is leading that work for us. And we hope that anyone in this room who's interested in your organisations in helping us with that, what we want to get to, working with the CIPD, is a model for how do you measure, how do you know whether on an outcomes basis you can call yourself an inclusive employer. And that's very interesting for us because we've done a bit of surveying of this with our population. About 15,000 civil servants come to a series of events we hold during the summer each year. And this year we asked this question. Interestingly, if you ask the question, do you think the civil service is inclusive, the majority say they do believe the civil service is inclusive. If you then ask the relative question, do you think you're the most inclusive employer, or we're the most inclusive employer, they don't agree with that. So there's an interesting question about expectation, reference points. It throws up all sorts of interesting questions about organisations who I think have done a lot of good for us, like Stonewall, BITC, and those, and how do they fit into that process? How do engagement surveys fit into it? So it's a very rich area of discussion. And I hope that we can, as employers, and WIG is a fantastic convening opportunity for this with CIPD, get to a point where we can take a view on that. The way we're looking at it is actually on the basis of maturity model. So for those in financial services, I think we've seen that work quite effectively in terms of conduct. And I think it's got very similar characteristics actually to that in terms of it's a very broad topic to measure. So finally, I just want to talk about the big sort of strategic issues which I think we're now encountering. And one of the great things about D&I from my perspective, like many other parts of HR, which is why I love the discipline so much, the people area, is that you go down a cave, a passageway, and then you come into this big new cave you never knew was there. On that, I think we've got some really interesting debates to have about segmentation. And how do we measure and make sure that groups are being properly represented while respecting the increasing social interest in intersectionality and people not wanting to be pigeonholed. That's an interesting challenge, particularly around things like socioeconomic background, but also about ethnicity, bearing in mind the largest population on an ethnic categorization basis is mixed race. So how do we engage with those topics? Now, on the one hand, there's a bit about not going too granular. So what is black? Well, I would say if we hadn't gone quite granular, we wouldn't have identified our Black Caribbean problem in the fast stream. Do we want to go more granular than that? Well, interestingly, the government's race disparity audit, which if people haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to have a look at, really fascinating data, breaks this down at really quite granular levels. Until I'd read that, I'd never asked myself the question about what was our representation and what did it mean if we didn't know about people who are Roma traveller. So there's some quite interesting questions there that we need to tackle collectively. And that's only in the area of ethnicity. Take it into the area of disability, and we really do not have a good methodology or way of segmenting that population in the same way. So the issue which we encountered with the fast stream, in a sense, if we had the same problem with a disability category, visual impairment, for example, or some aspect of mental health, we're not collecting the data that would even tell us that. So how do we want to engage with that question? And it's one that we need to look at quite carefully. So segmentation is one issue. I've mentioned inclusion because that is, I think, fundamentally linked to that. The other issue is around the issue of contextual recruitment. And this is very interesting because this is where our area of diversity and inclusion overlaps the area of automation. And the area of contextual recruitment is basically saying, I'm going to adjust my hiring criteria based on disadvantage. That's one way of looking at it. Now, that is a really complicated area. And I think we all need to be very mindful that people could be developing algorithms and could be developing techniques in that area without thinking about the broader consequences of it. It could be extremely helpful, or it could be actually another example where we need to be very thoughtful about algorithmic ethics and how we think about artificial intelligence and its impact on people in the workplace. So I throw that one out as another area which I think perhaps not in the next year, but over the next 5, 10 years, we're going to have a lot of interest, as we are in other areas like healthcare. I got a 2-minute signal, Peter, so I'll stop there. Thank you.